but he was better than Johnson and was named the starter for the 1969 season. Barry and then Johnson would each get hurt and replace one another, but they played surprisingly well when healthy. As a result, the Falcons, outscored by over 200 points in each of their previous 3 seasons, actually outscored their opposition in year 4. They sorta just treaded water over the next 3 years with Barry under center before trading him to Minnesota in a deal to acquire quarterback Bob Lee in 1973. Lee lost out on the starting gig to Dick Shiner to open the season, but after dropping 3 of their first 4 games, Lee replaced Shiner, and the Falcons immediately went on a lengthy winning streak. Lee's hold on the job would be short-lived, though. In 1974, he was benched multiple times for Pat Sullivan, but Sullivan struggled mightily as well and also got yanked late in the season. Enter their formerly third-string rookie out of Lehigh, Kim McQuilkin.
This is where we talk about the Atlanta Falcons passing attack in the mid-70s, which was bad in ways that are impossible to imagine today. I mean, if you made current Falcons quarterback Matt Ryan throw into a 35-man defense, he'd probably still come up with better stats than what we're about to see. I'm serious. At this early point in the story, I'd like to urge you to cherish this. Though it might seem like it now, this is not the story of a team that's perpetually hapless and awful. In the future, the Atlanta Falcons are going to do a whole lot of winning and a whole lot of contending. This is the one and only time we're going to go long on a Falcons team that deeply, genuinely sucks ass. There's a strange sort of beauty in that. Enjoy it while it lasts.
McQuilkin closed out a Week 12 loss to the Rams and threw 3 interceptions in the second half, bringing his career total to 4 on just 34 attempts. But Lee and Sullivan had been so disastrous all year that the Falcons figured they had nothing to lose and kept McQuilkin in the lineup for the final 2 games to see what he could do. First, the good news. They were in the midst of a 7-game losing streak when he took over, and they split his 2 starts. Now, the bad news. Another 5 of his passes were intercepted. That brought his rookie season to a close with his 79 passes generating just 373 yards, with 9 of them being picked off while still searching for his first career touchdown pass. Combined with miserable play out of Lee and Sullivan, who together threw 22 picks against 4 touchdowns, the 1974 Falcons passing offense was dreadful. Like, really dreadful. The NFL's 32 teams have combined to play 1,509 seasons since the AFL and NFL merged in 1970. Here's the passing proficiency of each and every one based on passer rating and adjusted net yards per attempt. Over 99% came in with a passer rating above 40, and most that didn't were at least close and at least had an adjusted net yards per attempt above 1. And then we have the 1974 Atlanta Falcons with a passer rating under 28 and a negative adjusted yards per attempt. Yeah, there's one squad, the 1977 Tampa Bay Buccaneers, that was even worse than they were. But as for the other 1,507, the 74 Falcons are complete outcasts from them. With their thorough inability to get anything going through the air, Atlanta had to turn to the draft to try and find some sort of answer at quarterback. And there was really only one strong option to pursue: the University of California's Steve Bartkowski. Sitting with the 3rd overall selection in the 1975 NFL Draft, and unable to afford missing out on the top prospect, to guarantee their ability to draft him, the Falcons had to ship one of the league's top offensive linemen, George Coons, along with the number 3 pick to the Colts to land the 1st overall pick. Seeking a new franchise quarterback after a season like Atlanta had in 1974 is understandable, as they were beyond atrocious through the air. But if they'd just been regular bad instead of that bad, they wouldn't have felt so much pressure to get a QB. Perhaps they could have instead kept their standout tackle, kept their 3rd overall pick, and taken, say, a dazzling running back prospect out of Jackson State by the name of Walter Payton. Anyway, midway through Bartkowski's rookie season, he dislocated his elbow, creating another chance for McQuilkin to play. Although he did throw his first career touchdown in relief against Cincy, it was overshadowed by 3 picks, and a listless first half the next week in New Orleans got him benched at halftime. With Bartkowski still shelved for another couple weeks and a trip to Minnesota on deck, McQuilkin was reinserted into the starting lineup. Entering that game, he'd thrown 13 career interceptions against just 1 touchdown, but we hadn't seen anything yet. Things may have been wobbly before, but here's where the wheels completely fall off. McQuilkin attempted 26 passes, completing 5 to each team for 43 yards with no touchdowns. Those 5 interceptions ensured him a passer rating on the day of 0.0. However, he was playing against the defending conference champion Vikings and their terrifying purple people eaters on defense. Like, Hall of Fame defensive end Carl Eller makes quarterbacks' lives miserable enough as a pass rusher. It's really not fair for him to also snag the only pick of his career right here by throwing a big paw up there on this screen pass and coming down with it. This was a really brutal game, so let's show some mercy and pretend that didn't happen. Okay, so he threw 4 picks. Oh, still 0. Maybe a receiver ran a bad route or deflected a well-thrown ball. That happens. Okay then, let's take a second interception off the board. Oh. In a somber post-game scene, McQuilkin had no words. Even reporters were speechless. McQuilkin returned the next year, and a month into the '76 season, Bartkowski suffered a season-ending knee injury. More McQuilkin.
Heart healthy and cost only cents per day. Quaker Oats, a super trusted superfood.
He played a lot like the previous 2 years and was eventually yanked from the lineup in a season that marked the final extensive playing time of his career. By passer rating and adjusted net yards per attempt, McQuilkin's first 3 seasons likely constituted 3 of the 4 worst by any quarterback to throw at least 60 passes in a campaign since the merger. Despite his level of play, McQuilkin wasn't one of the worst players or even quarterbacks in NFL history. For one, he managed to hang around the NFL for 7 years before voluntarily retiring, when most players are lucky to have a career half that long. Additionally, as underscored by the pitiful 1974 Falcons passing game whose ineptitude Bob Lee and Pat Sullivan were more responsible for than McQuilkin, he was embedded within a terrible offensive infrastructure in which all other men brave enough to try and play quarterback for the Falcons during the mid-'70s also struggled immensely. His protection wasn't up to snuff, and he had 0 coaching staff stability. What's ironic is that despite his noteworthy struggles during his time in the NFL, in the big picture, very few people have been as successful at as wide a variety of endeavors as Kim McQuilkin has. The man excelled in everything he tried his hand at after his playing days came to a close. First as a football analyst, then in becoming an executive with Cartoon Network, then in starting his own toy company that licensed merchandise for movies, then in presiding over a supply chain consulting business. And whereas plenty of non-stars don't stand out in any way and have boring, forgettable careers, McQuilkin's career lent itself to the creation of some fascinating charts for a documentary made about his Falcons nearly 50 years after he played for them. God, I love Kim McQuilkin.
I do too. This is our official editorial position. Kim McQuilkin rules. Now, all this decidedly subpar quarterbacking cuts even deeper once we consider who was actually presiding over most of it. Between 68 and 74, their head coach was not that far removed from a Hall of Fame career as a quarterback. In fact, many at the time considered him to be the best quarterback ever. Even before being subjected to all this horrendous passing happening right in front of him, this man was already established as one of the crankiest individuals ever to walk the earth. A big old crusty Dutchman who'd cuss you out as soon as look at you. Take just a minute to imagine what such a man might look like. How'd you do? Across all sports, the 1970s were a golden age for crabby red-ass coaches, and Norm Van Brocklin might have been the best of the best. He smoked like a chimney on the sideline. Who's gonna tell him no? This man was a former 2-time NFL champion quarterback, spending most of his playing days in Los Angeles, a place he hated because hippies confounded him. In fact, Norm hated everything that was less than 9,000 years old. He hated it when quarterbacks scrambled instead of standing in the pocket, When Lions kicker and Cyprus native Garo Yepremian used a newly introduced soccer-style kick to beat him, he wanted the government to take a hard line against the Cypriots. When the NFL merged with the AFL, his read on the situation was that the NFL was stupid, and also that the AFL was stupid. It couldn't have been easy for a guy who did so much winning as a player to do so much losing as a coach. His first stop was with the Minnesota Vikings, and seeing as they were a brand new franchise, Van Brocklin was able to draft players from other teams. There were a bunch of stiffs, he said, about the players he himself selected. After a few years of losing, he quit, then came back the next day and said he was a fighter, not a quitter, and then he lost some more and then he quit. Strangely, during his time in Atlanta, the press actually seemed to kinda like the guy, despite him calling them whores and sons of bitches and on one reported occasion grabbing them by the necktie. As an orator, he could stop on a dime and fly off the handle without warning. One of his post-game locker room speeches started with "I'm proud of you boys," and then immediately veered into a rant about how the Atlanta media apparatus was conspiring against him that involved multiple invocations of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. He concluded with a declaration that sounded like something straight out of the Nixon White House tapes. Van Brocklin loved Richard Nixon. He also hated Richard Nixon. What's interesting though is that the media didn't simply write him off as an asshole. They described him as a complete enigma, a man they just could not figure out. I think they knew that he was always kinda halfway serious, that he realized he'd never escape criticism no matter what he did, so there was no harm in upping the volume. On the field, Van Brocklin sorta righted the ship and curbed the outright freefall of the early years. In 1971, he led the Falcons to their first winning season. 2 years later, they ripped off 7 straight wins and found themselves at 8-4, well within reach of the NFC's wildcard spot. Best of all, their schedule was finally getting to the easy part. Up next were the 3-win St. Louis Cardinals, who had been completely wrecked by injuries in recent weeks. The Falcons even had home field advantage. This shouldn't have even been a contest. And it wasn't. The stage was set for what, to this very day, is easily one of the most agonizing, hideous NFL games ever played. You heard Alex mention passer rating. This is a metric that takes into account a quarterback's passing yards, completion percentage, touchdowns scored, and interceptions thrown. Mathematically, the best passer rating possible is 158.3, but few quarterbacks have ever managed that. In 2020, the average passer rating was about 93. The passing game has evolved dramatically over the last 50 years, as you can see. Back in 1973, the league average was about 65. Now, this metric has kind of a sick sense of humor. Imagine if on every play the quarterback took the ball, turned sideways, and threw it to a hot dog vendor in the crowd. Just straight up goes 0 for 20. No completions, no touchdowns, no interceptions. Because of the way the math is structured, his passer rating would sit at 39.6. So going lower than that is pretty humiliating. You get there by throwing interceptions. And if you're apocalyptically bad, it's mathematically feasible for you to get to absolute zero, the lowest possible rating. Since 1950, there have only been 91 instances of a passer throwing at least 10 passes and still finishing with a flat zero. Even back then, this only happened a couple times a year across the entire NFL. On this day against the Falcons in 1973, Cardinals quarterback Gary Keithley suffered this indignity. So did Bob Lee, the Falcons quarterback. Both starting quarterbacks finished with a passer rating of 0.0 in the same game. To this day, this is the only time this has ever happened. A game would have to be played in a hurricane for this to ever happen again. There's no explanation for it. There's no explanation for Pat Sullivan, the Falcons backup who replaced Lee, running up the gut and just dropping the ball with nobody in his solar system. There's no explanation for star linebacker Greg Brazina doing the same, recovering a fumble only to fumble it himself and watch the Cardinals take it in for 6 points. It was the most thorough mockery of the quarterback position ever seen in the NFL. And Norm Van Brocklin, once the greatest quarterback in America, had to watch it all happen right in front of him. Couldn't even muster any anger after the game. There was no big blow-up, no long diatribe about the Teapot Dome scandal or whatever. He just seemed sad. The loss ultimately torpedoed their playoff chances, and it precipitated another freefall that lasted several years. Van Brocklin saved his greatest performance for the very end, after a 42-7 hammering at the hands of the Miami Dolphins in 1974 that dropped the Falcons to 2-6. Today's coaches throw fits. Yeah, they'll yell at reporters or try to make them look stupid, but none of them are Norm Van Brocklin, who stood at the podium that day and basically said, "Fuck it, I will fight you all," challenging every reporter in the room to a fistfight, right then and there, straight up. No one took him up on it. I think everyone knew that he 100% meant it. He was fired the next day, and he never coached in the NFL again. To fans who'd wanted him fired for years, Norm Van Brocklin's inability to get to the playoffs eclipsed the fact that he'd built the Falcons into a team that could actually win a few games. When he passed away 9 years later, some of those in the media continued to insist that there was more to this man than most understood. Most didn't see the quintessential family man who melted down whenever he was around children, or insisted on visiting a sick young Falcons fan every day after practice. That isn't how Norm Van Brocklin went down in history. He didn't seem to care whether or not we saw that side of him. Nobody's ever any one person.
Through the first 6 years of play for the Atlanta Falcons, they never had a running back reach 1,000 rushing yards. The closest anyone had come was when Junior Coffey rushed for 722 yards in each of the franchise's first 2 seasons. Then before 1972, the team traded for Packers running back Dave Hampton. In Hampton's first year in Atlanta, he'd rushed for 930 yards heading into the final week of the season, in strong position to crack the 1,000-yard milestone. While not near Jim Brown's then record of over 1,800 yards, that 1,000-yard barrier's historically been a big badge of honor for running backs. At halftime of that game, he was named the Falcons' most valuable player and was presented with a giant trophy. Later in the fourth quarter, he indeed hit that 1,000-yard mark, and the game stopped so Hampton could be given a game ball and the home crowd could voice their appreciation. Then, this happened.
Peacock streaming the biggest sports and live events, from Notre Dame football and Sunday night football to football. Because if it brings fans to their feet, it's streaming on Peacock.
6-yard loss. Took him down to 994 yards. Hampton would get only one more carry for one more yard, finishing the season with 995. Just like that, poof, that magical 1,000-yard season had vanished into thin air. Hampton was crushed. He really wanted that comma in his rushing total, and to actually get it and then lose it was an extremely bitter pill to swallow. But hey, there's always next year, right? And what do you know, Hampton was once again in striking distance of 1,000, entering the Falcons' last game in 1973. It appeared his best efforts would again fall just short as he was stuck on 982 when they missed a field goal with under 2 minutes remaining. A subsequent interception, however, gave new life for Hampton to accomplish his goal that was so cruelly ripped from his grasp a year earlier. Feeding Hampton was Atlanta's only objective, and he picked up 10 yards across his next 2 carries, pulling within 8 yards of 1,000 with still enough time for 4 more carries. Those 4 carries produced 5 yards. Dave Hampton had followed up his 1,000-turn 995-yard season with a 997-yard season. Once again, he was torn up about it. Once more, there's always next year though, right? Actually, the next year, his 1974 season was derailed by injury, but hey, there's always the year after next, right? This was a burning desire with a flame that never faded. Hampton returned for training camp in 1975, a man on a mission for his 1,000 yards. He again had 900-something yards heading into the finale, a trip to his old stomping grounds in northeast Wisconsin. Winning was always the top priority for Hampton, who certainly didn't want to reach the milestone in lieu of team success. But that still wasn't going to stop him. There was simply no way, after all the twists and turns the football gods bestowed upon him over the last 3 years, that he was going to be denied here. Unfortunately for Hampton, his Falcons trailed by multiple scores for most of the second half, necessitating an air-based attack to try and get back in the game. But the story changed a bit when the Packers iced things late. So in the waning minutes of a freezing game that was out of reach, with Hampton at 972 yards on the season, the Falcons shifted into Operation Fulfill Hampton's Dream. An explosive 22-yard burst had him knocking on the door, and after breaking through on his next carry to reach 1,000 for the second time in his career, he called it a season, staying above 1,000 for the first time in his career.
Dave Hampton played one more injury-plagued season after that, and then he retired. He got it in right under the bell. Sure, a 1,000-yard season pales in comparison to some of the numbers other running backs were putting up at the time, but the Falcons just aren't there right now. They can't even come close to contending with the NFL's elite, the Steelers and Cowboys and whatnot. What these guys need is a companion. Now, there are some of you watching right now who are delighting in all of this. Every Falcons defeat, every fumble, every meltdown on and off the field, you're loving every second of it, aren't you? Don't worry. Didn't forget about you. The Atlanta Falcons and the New Orleans Saints, the NFL's Beavis and Butthead. You'd have to venture into the white-hot rage dimension of college sports to find a rivalry this intense. In professional sports, there's no rivalry like this one anywhere in America. Forget rivalries like Lakers-Celtics or Yankees-Red Sox that you're told you care about. There have been a few that burned with the heat of 1,000 suns, like Bulls-Pistons or Habs-Nordiques, but this is the only one that's been able to sustain that degree of hatred for half a century. Of all the possible matchups in the NFL, only 31 have been played at least 100 times, and Falcons-Saints is one of them. In almost all of these prolonged rivalries, one or both teams have won more games than they've lost throughout history. Up here, you've got two big historical winners, the Packers and Bears, who'd been duking it out for a century to various degrees of intensity. Down here, you've got Packers-Lions and Patriots-Jets, two pairings that are very much a big brother beating up on the little brother. Closer to the middle, you'll see a lot of the same AFC West teams that have been bottled up in the same tiny division, scrapping like rats in an outhouse for decades. These are teams that are traditionally competitive to one degree or another. And this is what makes Saints-Falcons so special. Two teams that have lost way more than they've won, meeting a couple times a year to beat on each other, because they couldn't beat on anybody else.
As a Falcons fan, there's no such thing as respecting the Saints in any shape or form. It's something I was taught from the very beginning of entering this sad fandom. At first, I didn't even really know why I was supposed to hate the Saints. It was just something that my uncles and older brother told me to do if I wanted to be a true fan. In so many words, I was told, in this household, we don't mess with the Saints. Period. So that was that. With every matchup, I would watch the rage build up inside of them, as they shouted at the TV with a little more extra flair than usual because it was Aints Week. I was hooked from there. What makes this matchup so special is the pure pettiness from both fan bases. Of course, we hate each other, but it's hard to find more entertaining shit-talking that you can find between the people of Atlanta and New Orleans. It's roasting at its finest. The Falcons could legitimately go 2-14 on the season, but as long as those two wins come against the Saints, Falcons fans would still be insufferable.
Sports rivalries often take decades to form. This one sprung up almost immediately. It's Week 11 in the 1967 season, the Saints' first season and the Falcons' second. Both teams are terrible. This is the first time they ever meet in the regular season, and for most of the afternoon, it looks like Atlanta's finally going to pick up an easy win.
After all, they were cruising early, having jumped out to a 21-3 lead in the second quarter. Slowly but surely, the Saints score 17 unanswered points to pull within 1 in the fourth quarter. The Falcons respond by kicking a field goal to go up 4 with under 4 minutes left. New Orleans gets one final chance to complete their unlikely comeback from down 18, but the Falcons are in good shape. They just gotta defend their end zone against the opposing backup quarterback. Even as the Saints march their way down into the red zone, it's not long before they're staring down the barrel of a 4th and 14 with the game on the line. Quarterback Billy Kilmer's first read is wideout Flea Roberts in the flat, but he quickly looks the other way before firing a pass downfield into the end zone that gets picked off. Game over. Except there's a reason he didn't throw to the flat. Falcons DB Jerry Richardson had apparently committed pass interference against Roberts, even if he disputes the timing of the alleged infraction. The Saints, with new life, go on to score the game-winning touchdown, then defensively hang on by a thread to win the first chapter of this storied rivalry.
This was the first of 103 body blows and counting that the Falcons and Saints will deal each other. It was excruciating for Falcons fans to see their team build a 21-3 lead, only to lose in the end. See, you gotta get to 28. Make it 28-3 and you're golden. Those of you who have read ahead know that both these teams would go on to do a good amount of winning at some point or another, but this era was all about two bad teams learning how to hate each other. After losing their first encounter, the Falcons ripped off 9 wins in a row against the Saints. Many of these were routs, but one in particular was a clobbering that made history. This is every instance in the post-merger era in which a team lost on their home field by at least 35 points. You typically only see this happen once or twice a year in the NFL. You never see this, a 55-point loss in front of your home fans. Approximately half the population of Metro Atlanta scored a touchdown in this one. After Saints quarterback Archie Manning was knocked out, backup Bob Davis came in and managed to pass a rating of 1.7. Let's jump back over here just a minute. We've already established that a passer rating of 0 is abysmal, but to approach it as closely as 1.7 without actually reaching it, you have to do something really gnarly, and that's what Davis did. His total passing yardage at the end of the day was -5. Davis is one of only 3 to attempt at least 10 passes and still somehow finish below 0 yards. The Falcons were running out of ways to humiliate the Saints that day. Those of you who have older siblings will surely see him in Ken Burrow, who, after hauling in touchdown number 6,000, taunts everyone in the building who's bothered to stick around this long. You gonna spike it? Nope. You gonna spike it again? Nope. Yep. Y'all ain't worth it. I mean, it's a tale as old as time. The Falcons themselves suffered plenty of bulldozings in this era, most notably a 59-0 loss to the Rams that ranks among the worst the NFL's ever seen. As youngsters, the Falcons were having a lot of trouble at school. This is why they needed the Saints. Go out there, get shoved around, come back home to the South, pick a fight with their sibling. That's how they dealt with it. But although it didn't seem like it, the Falcons in the mid-1970s were right on the precipice of two things. First, they were about to invent new and more devastating ways to beat the Saints. And second, they were about to enter an era that most fans today have completely forgotten. These Atlanta Falcons didn't want to make the decades-long slog toward respectability that most new teams settle for. They wanted to win a Super Bowl. Now.
Cold case in Alaska. Her death is part of a pattern, and we need to show who's to blame.
We're gonna break this story.
You ever try to assemble a piece of furniture without bothering to look at the instructions? You know, you just shoot from the hip and slap it all together according to what your idea of a 6-drawer bedroom dresser should look like? Well, that dresser, the one with the chunks of particle board missing where you tried to pry out fasteners with a couple of drawers that don't open because you screwed the runners in backwards, is the helplessly crooked 1976 Atlanta Falcons. You couldn't have set a pencil on top of them without it rolling off the side. This team sent several distress signals, the strongest of which was a Week 7 encounter in San Francisco. Early on in this one, Falcons punter John James set up to punt the ball away deep in his own territory. Botched punts sometimes result in safeties, but I don't know if I've ever seen a snap fly so far over the punter's head that it might have actually sailed through the uprights. The official play-by-play describes what we're seeing here as ball centered out of end zone. Google that phrase and you'll mostly find high school games. But that wasn't even the half of it. The Falcons would have been better off if their passing game simply didn't work that night. It was worse than that. They threw for a grand total of 46 yards, which for starters is beyond pitiful. Thing is, their quarterbacks were sacked 8 times for a total loss of 85 yards. That meant their passing game netted negative 39 yards. Whenever they dropped back to throw, they averaged about negative 1 yard per play. I won't blame the players for this, it all came from the top. After owner Rankin Smith fired Norm Van Brocklin in '74, he elevated assistant Marion Campbell to the top job. After the Falcons suffered a second free fall, general manager Pat Pepler insisted to Smith that they couldn't wait, that they had to fire Campbell mid-season. "Okay," Smith said, "you're the coach now." Pepler, who had never coached football above the high school level, didn't want to be the coach. Too bad. He was now both general manager and head coach. After some more losing, during which he openly told the press he felt like he was being set up, he was fired from both his jobs. The Atlanta Falcons were in desperate need of leadership. And they did what should always be done, when the moment requires a fearless leader, a great conqueror to lead the way to victory. They found a Kentuckian. Paducah, Kentucky's own Lehman Bennett had spent the last few years with a Rams team that had done a lot of winning. Like all Kentuckians, he was a famously chilled-out person who everyone liked and thought was cool. Unlike the galactically cranky Van Brocklin and the rabble of unhappy, overwhelmed coaches that came before him and after him, Bennett seemed completely comfortable in his role, and he wanted his players to be happy in theirs. In insisting on a 5-year deal as the NFL's youngest coach, he demonstrated his ambition but also his pragmatism. Unlike most modern NFL teams, he understood that a coach needs time to win without worrying the axe could fall at any second. In his first year, Coach Bennett started delivering with a 7-7 record that, at this point, the organization was more than happy with. Remarkably, he did this with really underwhelming production on the offensive side of the ball. Here we see the average points per game scored by every team in the post-merger era. The 77 Falcons are down here, having averaged a shade under 13 points per game. Pretty weak. Now, let's look at how many points they allowed on the other side of the ball. In terms of points allowed, the 1977 Falcons fielded the best defense of the last 50 years. No, really.
It was a year in which, especially at the outset, it was like they were facing high school offenses. Through the first 5 games of the season, they allowed just 22 points, an impossibly low 4.4 per game. 23 years later, over in that weird baseball sport, a fellow by the name of Andy Pettit had an ERA of 4.35. More than a third of the way through the 1977 season, the Falcons were allowing roughly the same amount of points per game as the ERA of a guy who was at the front end of a World Series winning starting pitcher rotation.
You know what, let's stay on baseball for just a minute. Remember that the Falcons and Braves were roommates, sharing the field at Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. Here's the points/runs they gave up on that field in '77. All 7 Falcons home games are in here, as is every Braves home game. Here's a fun one. Can you guess which ones belong to the Falcons? You're probably wrong. The Falcons actually look like they belong on this chart, despite, the fact that football typically produces way more points than baseball. In fact, it was the Braves, who gave up 23 runs in a game in April, who made the worst defensive stand on this field. I'm not sure which team that says more about.
1977 marked the final year before the NFL expanded the regular season schedule to 16 games per club. But in the swan song of that archaic length, it was still long enough for the Falcons to sneak in 10 games in which they allowed no more than 10 points. They had by far the league's stingiest defense, and the focal point around whom everything revolved was their legendary Hall of Fame defensive end, Claude Humphrey. Initially, however, it appeared they may not have him to spearhead this unit. A year earlier in 1976, a few things had soured him on the organization. One was the mid-season firing of Marion Campbell, who'd been a mentor for years and someone who Humphrey felt extreme loyalty toward. That was just salt on the wound after they'd traded away his pass-rushing partner in crime, John Zook, which took a huge physical and emotional toll on him. Nevertheless, at age 32 and coming off torn knee ligaments, Humphrey dominated in his return to the field. The 10-year vet didn't want to spend the twilight to his career without a chance to contend for a championship, so Humphrey asked to be traded. It seemed inevitable that the team would be parting ways with arguably the greatest player they'd ever had. They couldn't have known how fortunate they were at the time, but ultimately, after a series of meetings, they resolved their differences and welcomed Humphrey back to the team early in training camp to lead what would become a historic defensive juggernaut. Secondary coach Jerry Glanville was the architect and de facto coordinator of the unit, which was nicknamed the Grits Blitz by a bread delivery guy, according to Glanville. As the name implies, the unorthodox scheme was predicated around overwhelming the offense by flooding the box and dialing up every pressure package imaginable without ever fearing the potential repercussions. Take this Week 3 play against the Giants. It's a 2nd and 30 when New York calls a screen to try and neutralize Atlanta's relentless pass rush. That relentless pass rush couldn't care less. Glanville crowds the line of scrimmage, unleashing no fewer than 7 Falcons after a quarterback who has to pick up a mile for a first down. Even though they're exposed to a big play if that screen gets lofted up there with enough air under it, the immediacy with which the Falcons' rush gets home renders that moot and they bat the ball away. That is the kind of destruction the Grits Blitz inflicted on a weekly basis. Individually, Humphrey was an all-timer, and for a while, cornerback Rollin Lawrence was an interception machine. But as Glanville eloquently explained, overall this was a defense where the whole far exceeded the sum of the parts. None of the league's offensive coordinators were able to figure out the antidote for a defense simply bringing virtually the entire house on virtually every play. If you think I'm exaggerating, in the first game of the season against the Rams, their defense ran 54 plays. Glanville blitzed both safeties on 46 of them. Double safety blitzes over 85% of the time. Eventually, Chargers coach Don Coryell neutered this defensive philosophy with the brilliant idea to adjust his blocking scheme and attack all those juicy one-on-one matchups downfield. And because of that, the 77 Falcons defense was a flash in the pan. Mediocre before Glanville arrived, and with the book out on how to make his strategy backfire, mediocre after.
So, no, the Falcons did not deliver a defensive performance that was anywhere near as good in 1978. You know what they did do? They went to the playoffs. Yeah. Again, lest you think this is the story of a perennial loser, a team that never went anywhere or did anything, you should know that the Atlanta Falcons have fielded a lot of playoff teams. This was their first, and definitely not their best. This was a team that allowed 50 more points than it scored across the season. In terms of point differential, the 8 teams to make the playoffs that season were the 6 best teams, the middle-of-the-pack Vikings, and these Falcons, who ranked 24th of 28. This is, and always has been, a great way to make everyone in the NFL mad at you. Everybody was talking shit. After the 1-12 Bengals beat them 37-7 in Week 14, one Bengal said there was no way the team they just blew to pieces was going to the playoffs. A week later, when the Falcons squeaked one out over Washington on the final play, quarterback Joe Theismann said they were completely undeserving. You know what? I get where they were coming from. Generally speaking, this was not a very good team. To make the postseason, they needed a springboard, and they found it in the New Orleans Saints, who were more mad at the Falcons than anyone. The Saints' Ralph McGill was heated. They all were. They ain't better than the Saints, he said. Not on the field, not on paper. I take no pleasure in reporting this. The Saints couldn't win for losing. It's all they ever did. Entering this season, the Falcons had beaten them often, going 12-6 all-time against them, and they'd beaten them badly, outscoring them 415 points to 273. But in 1978, they found more elegant ways to devastate them. This was the year Falcons vs. Saints began to escalate from one-sided regional feud into arguably the most hot-blooded rivalry ever seen in professional American sports. They first met in the Superdome, the Saints' brand new space-age facility that, they didn't have to share with a baseball team. This was really the only thing the Saints could hold over the Falcons, but in Week 11 they were looking for more. For the first time in their 12-year history, the Saints were not terrible. They even had an outside shot at the playoffs heading into this one at 5-5. And with just 10 seconds left in the ballgame, they held a 17-13 lead over Atlanta. The Falcons have the ball at their own 43-yard line and one last shot. Down by 4, a field goal is no good. They gotta go for 6. We have data stretching back to 1994 detailing every time a team has run a play from their own territory while trailing within the final 10 seconds of a game. There have been 716 such attempts. 5 have resulted in touchdowns. The Falcons are attempting football's Kobayashi Maru, a puzzle solved by almost no one. There is no such thing as a winning strategy here. You just have to throw it as far as you can and hope it breaks something. In this moment, the Falcons need a quarterback who can win a game with his arm. They've never had one. All they've ever had is a platoon of guys who were shoved out there to stare down the terrifying NFL defenses of the 1960s and 70s and do the best they could. But this Sunday, they're seeing the emergence of their first great field general. Steve Bartkowski had taken a few years to find his footing. If he'd been drafted by any other team, he might have been able to take a year or two to serve as backup and learn the ropes, but no team was as desperate for a quarterback as the Falcons, who drafted him first overall and immediately put him on active duty. After a rough rookie season in 1975, his play seriously regressed in 76 and 77. They called him Peachtree Bart, named after the street where he was seen partying every night. He threw more interceptions than touchdowns, but the simple fact that he wasn't afraid to throw deep and go for broke made him a fan favorite. There's more than one Peachtree Street, though, and there was more than one Bart. When he learned that yet another injury required season-ending surgery, he walked out of the hospital, wandered the city, and cried for hours. In just a few years, he'd fallen from college superstar to seriously underwhelming party boy, frequently injured and in the process of flaming out. And then he found the Lord. Although he went undrafted out of Nazareth, Jesus Christ has been credited as the driving force behind many Super Bowl victories. Was he really? I don't know. But if you're telling a story about the South, there's no way he can be left out. Evangelical Christianity was really taking hold in America in this time, especially here. It was an interpretation that stood apart from the fire and brimstone type that had dominated the South for so long. Instead, it emphasized love, a promise of a personal relationship with the one who created you. In a time when technology and culture were changing at staggering rates, the economy was crashing, and the state rattled your cage every couple years with warnings that Fidel Castro was in a missile silo somewhere staring at a big red button that said, I don't know, Ackworth, Georgia on it, it's certainly very easy to empathize. It's even easier in the case of a quarterback who's watching his dreams fall apart. Many in the Falcons' locker room were religious, but veteran linebacker Greg Brzezina was perhaps the biggest evangelical influence. He witnessed to Bartkowski, and after a brutal preseason outing in '78 that ended up with him getting booed out of Atlanta Fulton County Stadium, he prayed the prayer. Now, I imagine that even he would tell you that his stats didn't improve because God favored him, but whatever reason you chalk it up to, Bart's numbers made a complete turnaround after that. After injuries contributed to an almost unthinkably bad 1977, he rebounded dramatically, and actually went on to become one of the best quarterbacks in football for a time. Back to the Superdome. Bart has a cannon for an arm, and represents the Falcons' best chance to pull off the near impossible. He hurls it into the deep. His target, receiver Wallace Francis, runs right into the Saints' prevent defense, and the pass is broken up. In today's NFL, defenders are taught to swat down the ball in this situation rather than going for the interception, and there is a reason for that. In going for the ball, the Saints inadvertently punch it back up into the air, and right into the hands of rookie wideout Alfred Jackson, who takes it in for the game-winning touchdown. He's done it. Bart believes in Bart. And maybe God believes in Bart too.
Heart healthy and cost only cents per day. Quaker Oats, a super trusted superfood.
The Falcons allowed the Saints to believe they were legitimate contenders for a couple hours, and then they slammed the door shut. The two emotions in football are sad and mad, and having accomplished the former, the Falcons pushed the latter button in Week 13. It was a reversal of their first ever meeting in 1967, in which the Falcons saw their game-sealing interception erased by a pass interference call. 11 years later, an intercepted Steve Bartkowski throw should have ended the game, but didn't, thanks to a pass interference call that, well, they didn't show it in any game recaps, and I think there's a reason for that. It was such a poor piece of officiating that after the season, NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle reviewed it and singled it out as the wrong call. This was the year the Falcons and Saints genuinely started hating each other. In the 40-plus years since, sometimes both teams have been very good. Sometimes one has been bad, sometimes both have been bad. None of that has mattered. The temperature has never dropped from this point. But in the short term, this stolen win meant yet another losing record for the Saints, and the first ever playoff appearance for the Atlanta Falcons.
Atlanta welcomed the Eagles to town on Christmas Eve, where neither team seems a strong threat to make a deep playoff run. Near the end of the first quarter, the Eagles strike first when quarterback Ron Jaworski hits Pro Bowl wideout Harold Carmichael to take a 6-0 lead. On to kick the extra point trots out Philly's punter after coach Dick Vermeil decided to plot place-kicking duties onto Mike Michel in the wake of an injury to their kicker a month earlier. Even though Vermeil couldn't have had much faith in him, the Eagles didn't even attempt a single field goal in any of their final 4 regular season games since Michel took over double duty, though he did miss an extra